The Museum Night Watchman. The gilded mask of the Dynasty 19 sarcophagus looked down through the gloom of the Egyptian gallery with the serene, unblinking indifference of 3,000 years, its lapis lazuli eyes catching the first gray light of a November dawn. At its feet, sprawled upon the polished parquet flooring beside an overturned velvet barrier rope, lay the body of Sidney Orff, the museum's night watchman for 22 years, his brass clocking-in key still clutched in his stiffened right hand. The sensational morning papers in London would scream of the pharaoh's vengeance and the ancient curse of the tomb, for the heavy glass case had not been shattered, the perimeter alarms had not been tripped, and not a single jewel had been disturbed. But beneath the dead watchman's left elbow lay a brass-bound pocket spring balance and an ordinary museum exhibition catalogue, opened to an exhibit whose official printed weight was recorded as 11 pounds 4 ounces, exactly 6 pounds lighter than any block of solid Egyptian alabaster had ever weighed since the creation of the world. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, joining you tonight from Ohio. Tonight's story invites us into the quiet, echoing galleries of a provincial English museum, a place where history is catalogued, preserved, and guarded behind glass, but where human vanity and intellectual pride have found a way to practice the most cunning deception. It is a mystery of ancient relics, an elderly watchman whose tedious habit of weighing things in the dark became his death warrant, and an exhibition catalogue whose neat printed numbers concealed a 3-year trail of theft and substitution. Before we step into the shadowed halls of the Calloway Museum, let me ask you, have you ever encountered a deception so elaborate and maintained for so long that the person practicing it began to believe their own illusion was more real than the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read each one with great appreciation, and tonight's mystery offers much to consider about the weight of what we choose to bury. Now, the gallery doors are unlocked, and the night watchman's round has begun. Let us step inside together. Chapter 1. The Broken Seal. Exhibit 1A, Sarcophagus of Horjed Ptah, High Priest of Memphis. Polished limestone, pigment, and gold leaf. Dynasty 19, circa 1250 BCE. Bequeathed by Lord Calloway, 1894. Catalogued weight, 420 pounds. The Calloway Municipal Museum stood at the quiet northern end of the market town of Calloway, in Berkshire. A dignified Victorian structure of red brick and Portland stone, built in 1884 to house the natural history specimens, Roman pottery, and antiquities collected by the 3rd Baron Calloway during his Mediterranean travels. Surrounded by formal municipal gardens where ancient plane trees dropped their golden leaves upon damp gravel paths, the museum was regarded by the townspeople with a mixture of civic pride and respectful indifference. The history of the Calloway collection was intimately bound up with the grand imperial archaeology of the late 19th century. In 1892, the 3rd Baron Calloway, having financed extensive excavations in the Fayum and at Luxor, alongside the legendary Flinders Petrie, had returned to England with 70 crates of monumental stone, funerary papyri, and gold-leafed cartonnage. To house these treasures, he had commissioned a grand neoclassical gallery with Corinthian pilasters of Derbyshire spar, a vaulted glass skylight supported by cast-iron arches, and display vitrines of solid polished Honduras mahogany fitted with 1-inch English plate glass. For 60 years, the museum had stood as a temple of quiet scholarship, where generations of schoolboys had pressed their noses against the glass to marvel at the painted faces of pharaohs, and where the air smelled eternally of floor wax, dry stone, and ancient dust. On a bleak Wednesday in late November, the museum was scheduled to open its newly refurbished Egyptian Antiquities Wing, a project that had occupied the curator, Dr. Raymond Croft, for more than 2 years. The market town of Calloway had changed remarkably little since the days when stagecoaches had rattled along the Bath Road. Situated in a sheltered valley beneath the Berkshire Downs, its high street was a picturesque blend of timber-framed Tudor inns with overhanging gables, dignified Georgian townhouses with fanlight doorways of carved pine, and the great medieval gatehouse of the former abbey. On Wednesday mornings, the market square was filled with the pungent scents of sheep dip, damp fleece, sharp cheddar cheese, and fresh cider apples, while farmers and gators argued over the price of winter barley beneath the shadow of the Buttercross. It was the sort of quintessential English country town where everyone knew the history of every family for 3 generations, and where a stranger walking down the street at dusk was instantly noted by 20 pairs of eyes behind lace curtains. Miss Hartley's journey from Hampshire had been a delightful, unhurried progression through an autumn countryside crowned in russet and gold. Traveling by the branch line train through Newbury, she had arrived at Calloway Station on Tuesday afternoon with her small leather dressing case and her knitting basket, to be met upon the platform by Mrs. Hartwell's elderly parlour-maid, Florence. The walk through the cathedral close to Mrs. Hartwell's house had been a soothing prelude to the evening's festivities. The ancient elms, whose roots dug deep into the green lawns where medieval canons had once strolled, dropped a slow, golden shower of leaves across the flagstones. Above the rooftops, the great 4-tiered tower of the cathedral rose into the pale November sky like a mountain of silver lace, its chimes striking the quarters with a deep, resonant gravity that seemed to measure out eternity in musical intervals. She had been invited to attend the private evening view by her dear friend, Mrs. Vera Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, the widow of a distinguished county magistrate and a substantial benefactor of the museum, lived in a comfortable Queen Anne house overlooking the cathedral close, where she devoted her remaining years to the study of local archaeology and the cultivation of prize chrysanthemums. "You will find Dr. Croft a most remarkable scholar, Judith," Mrs. Hartwell had remarked over tea on Tuesday. "He was at Oxford, you know, and spent 10 years working with the Antiquities Department in Cairo before the war. A man of immense erudition, though somewhat sensitive about his professional standing. He has reorganized the entire collection with extraordinary precision. Every single scarab, amulet, and canopic jar has been re-examined, weighed, and re-catalogued in the new printed guide." The private view on Tuesday evening had been an occasion of considerable municipal splendor. The great gas chandeliers in the central atrium had been illuminated, casting a warm, golden radiance across the marble floors, while a string quartet from the county orchestra played Vivaldi in the gallery balcony. Miss Hartley, accompanied by Mrs. Hartwell in her lavender silk gown, had walked through the newly arranged exhibits, admiring the brilliant turquoise glaze of the New Kingdom faience and the solemn majesty of the limestone reliefs. Dr. Raymond Croft had moved among his guests like an intellectual prince, receiving the congratulations of the bishop and the mayor with an air of modest, scholarly condescension. Yet Miss Hartley, whose habit of observing human faces was as natural as breathing, had noticed a strange, feverish brightness in the curator's eyes, sharp, restless vigilance that seemed curiously at odds with the celebratory champagne and the polite murmurs of the county society. At 10 o'clock that evening, the heavy oak doors had been bolted by Sidney Orff, the senior night watchman, and the gallery lights had been extinguished. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, when Mrs. Batty, the senior cleaning attendant, unlocked the side basement door to begin sweeping the entrance vestibule, she found the gallery in darkness. Walking up the marble staircase with her mop and bucket, she entered the Egyptian wing and stopped dead upon the threshold with a shriek that brought Constable Clowder running from the high street. Sidney Orff lay dead upon the parquet floor beside the central glass case containing the great painted limestone sarcophagus of Horjed Ptah. He lay upon his back, his dark blue watchman's coat buttoned to the neck, his silver hair spread upon the polished wood. There was no blood upon the floor, no sign of a struggle, and no weapon in sight. His clocking-in key with which he punched the recording dials at 20 stations throughout the museum, every 40 minutes, was clutched in his right hand. Beside his left elbow lay two objects: a small circular brass pocket spring balance, capable of weighing objects up to 20 pounds, and a copy of the newly printed Calloway Museum exhibition catalogue, bound in terracotta paper. By 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the quiet gravel driveway of the Calloway Museum had been invaded by a dozen eager journalists and press photographers from London, their flash powder cameras exploding in blinding white puffs against the grey November drizzle. The Daily Chronicle and the Evening Standard had already prepared sensational front-page headlines proclaiming, "The Curse of Horjed Ptah Strikes in Berkshire," and "Night Watchman Found Dead at Feet of 3,000-year-old Mummy." Constable Clowder, looking hot, flustered, and profoundly out of his depth, stood at the wrought iron gates, attempting to hold back the crowd of curious townspeople, schoolboys, and reporters who jostled against the railings. To the sensational press, the death of Sidney Orff was an irresistible supernatural romance, a terrifying vindication of the ancient superstition that those who disturb the resting places of the pharaohs are doomed to sudden, mysterious destruction. It was the sort of lurid, Gothic melodrama that sells newspapers by the 100,000, and which conveniently blinds the world to the cold, calculating reality of human crime. Inspector Bradley of the Berkshire Constabulary arrived by motor car at 8:30. "A heart attack, undoubtedly," Inspector Bradley declared after a preliminary examination by Dr. Thorne. Orff was 67 years of age, suffered from chronic bronchitis, and climbed 4 flights of stone stairs 12 times every night. He reached the sarcophagus on his 2 o'clock round, felt a sudden seizure in his chest, dropped his balance, and collapsed. "And the sensational reporters from the Daily Mail?" Hartwell asked, gesturing toward the crowd of journalists gathering at the wrought iron gates. "Nonsense about the pharaoh's curse," Bradley scoffed. "Because the old man died beside a mummy case. The public loves a ghost story, but there is no mystery here. Nothing is missing, the glass cases are intact, and the exterior doors were locked from the inside when the cleaner arrived." Miss Hartley, who had walked down to the museum with Mrs. Hartwell to offer their condolences to the staff, stood quietly at the edge of the velvet rope, her hands folded in her woolen muff. She looked at the dead watchman's face. It was calm, relaxed, without the terrible, contorted agony of a man stricken by sudden cardiac arrest. She looked at the brass pocket spring balance lying beside his fingers. And then she looked at the printed catalogue resting upon the floor. The book was open to page 14, where an entry for a small carved limestone relief had been marked with a faint, pencil-drawn question mark in the margin. "A heart seizure is a very sudden thing, Inspector Bradley," Miss Hartley remarked in her gentlest, most diffident voice. "In St. Mary Mead, when poor Mr. Barnes the draper suffered a fatal stroke while taking down a bolt of flannel, he clutched the shelf so violently that he brought 3 yards of calico down upon his head. But Mr. Orff appears to have placed his reading spectacles neatly in his breast pocket, laid his catalogue upon the floor, and sat down before he expired. And why, I wonder, would a night watchman carry a brass spring balance in his pocket while making his midnight rounds in an Egyptian gallery?" Chapter 2. The Canopic Jar. Exhibit 2B, Canopic Jar representing Hapi, the baboon-headed son of Horus. Carved white calcite alabaster with incised hieroglyphic inscription. Dynasty 18, circa 1350 BCE. Presented by the Hartwell Estate, 1912. Catalogued weight, 5 pounds 2 ounces. By noon on Wednesday, the Egyptian gallery had been closed to the public by order of the museum trustees, but Miss Hartley, through the gracious influence of Mrs. Hartwell, was permitted to remain in the building while the preliminary statements were recorded in the curator's study. The study was a vast, book-lined room on the mezzanine floor, smelling pleasantly of old vellum, leather dressing, Turkish tobacco, and lavender polish. Upon the large mahogany desk stood a green-shaded reading lamp, several magnifying glasses under brass stands, and a delicate set of chemical balances under a glass case. The curator's study was a sanctuary of meticulous archaeological science. Along the northern wall stood 3 tall glass-fronted specimen cabinets filled with chemical reagents, bottles of ethyl alcohol, jars of microcrystalline wax, and fine camel hair brushes used for the conservation of ancient pigments. In the corner, beside a cast of the Rosetta Stone, stood a heavy iron screw press used for flattening ancient papyrus fragments between sheets of plate glass. It was a room designed for the patient, reverent preservation of human memory, a place where a dedicated scholar might spend 50 years deciphering the forgotten prayers of dead dynasties. Miss Hartley looked at the delicate brass balances under the glass bell jar on the desk. "Such exquisite precision, Dr. Croft," Miss Hartley remarked, pointing her gloved finger at the micro-weights resting in their velvet-lined mahogany box. "In St. Mary Mead, our dear old apothecary Mr. Cheriton had a set of balances just like these. He used to say that when a man is dealing with deadly poisons or pure gold, a difference of 3 grains is the difference between life and death. One must be so exceedingly careful with the exact weight of things." The Egyptian Antiquities Gallery occupied the entire eastern wing of the museum's upper floor. It was a long, lofty hall designed with severe Neo-Egyptian motifs, its doorway flanked by heavy stone Taurus moldings and lotus capital pillars carved from Bath stone. Along the walls, beneath the high arched windows, stood 20 glass vitrines constructed of dark Spanish mahogany, each illuminated by concealed tubular electric lamps that cast a soft museum glow across the exhibits. In the center of the room, raised upon a low plinth of polished black basalt, stood the great limestone sarcophagus of Hor-Gent Ptah. Surrounding it in concentric cases were the funerary treasures of the high priest's tomb, carved alabaster ointment vessels shaped like swimming ducks, turquoise-glazed faience necklaces strung with gold beads, bronze mirrors polished to a silvery gleam, and 6 wooden Ushabti boxes painted in brilliant vermilion and Egyptian blue. To an ordinary visitor, the gallery was an overwhelming testament to the luxury and spiritual devotion of the ancient Nile. But to someone who looked with the quiet, penetrating scrutiny of Miss Hartley, there was something subtly, indefinably wrong with the atmosphere of the room. The air was too dry, smelling intensely of cellulose lacquer and modern synthetic resin, rather than the cold mineral damp of 3,000-year-old stone. Dr. Raymond Croft sat behind the desk, looking pale, exhausted, and profoundly distressed. He was a gentleman of 49, with thinning dark hair brushed straight back, sharp, aquiline features, and deep-set gray eyes that seemed perpetually shadowed by intense intellectual concentration. He wore an elegant suit of dark brown Harris tweed, with a bronze silk cravat, and his long, delicate hands toyed nervously with an ancient bronze scarab paperweight. "A terrible, unspeakable tragedy, Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Croft said, his voice cultured, resonant, and melancholy. "Sidney Orff was the soul of this museum. He was appointed by my predecessor in 1930, and he guarded our treasures as though they were his own children. To think that he should pass away on the very eve of our grand reopening." "He was an extraordinarily meticulous man, was he not, Dr. Croft?" Miss Hartley asked, taking a chair by the hearth. "Meticulous to a fault, Miss Hartley," Croft replied with a faint, sorrowful smile. "Poor Sidney had an obsession with routine. For 30 years, he kept his own private notebooks, recording the room temperatures, the humidity readings, the exact time the boiler was stoked, and even the positions of the display cases. He had a passion for physical measurement that was almost childlike. If a case was moved 3 inches during cleaning, Sidney would note it in his logbook before he went off duty. At that moment, the study door opened, and Miss Evelyn Price entered, carrying a stack of typewritten inventory sheets. Miss Price was the museum's junior cataloguer and assistant, a quiet, devoted young woman of 28, with intelligent brown eyes behind round horn-rimmed spectacles, dressed in a sensible, knitted twinset of navy wool. Her eyes were red with weeping, and her hands trembled as she laid the papers upon Croft's desk. "Dr. Croft," Miss Price said, her voice shaking slightly, "I have completed the verification of the glass cases in the Egyptian gallery, as Inspector Bradley requested. Every lock is secure, and every seal is intact." "Thank you, Miss Price," Croft said gently. "You see, ladies, not a single artifact disturbed." "Miss Price," Miss Hartley asked softly, looking up at the young woman, "did Mr. Orff say anything unusual to you before he began his shift last night?" Miss Price hesitated, glancing anxiously at Dr. Croft before answering. He was very quiet yesterday afternoon, Miss Hartley. When I was typing the final labels for the Dynasty 18 case, Sidney came into the office. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the street. And then he said to me, 'Miss Evelyn, when something that ought to be heavy feels as light as balsa wood, a man has to ask himself whether his arms are growing old, or whether the stone has lost its soul.' I thought he was merely feeling his age, poor man. But he didn't knock on Dr. Croft's door at 10 o'clock, as he always did." "He had a signal, then?" Miss Hartley asked. "Yes," Miss Price said, a tear escaping her eye. "Every night for 5 years, when Sidney finished his first round at 10 o'clock, he would knock twice upon Dr. Croft's door, tap, tap, to let him know that the outer bolts were shot and the gallery was secure. But last night there was no knock. When I left the museum at 10:15, Dr. Croft was still working at his desk, and the gallery was entirely silent." Dr. Croft cleared his throat, adjusting his cravat with a slight, involuntary movement. "I was engrossed in my paper on the Amarna reliefs until nearly midnight, Miss Hartley. I assumed poor Sidney had simply carried on with his second round without disturbing me. The baboon Canopic Jar of Happy was my late husband's dearest possession, Judith," Mrs. Hartwell recalled, her voice soft with nostalgic affection. "Arthur purchased it in Cairo in 1911 from the famous French antiquarian Gaston Maspero. He used to keep it upon his library desk in this very house, and whenever he had a difficult legal problem to consider, he would rest his fingers upon the cool alabaster head. He loved the gentle, translucent quality of the stone, how the light from the reading lamp would shine through the thin edges like honey. When he bequeathed it to the museum in his will, he said to the mayor, 'Take good care of Happy, Mr. Mayor. He has listened to the confessions of 30 years of Berkshire squires, and he has never repeated a word.'" Miss Hartley smiled warmly. "A beautiful sentiment. And how very sad that a stone that had kept silent counsel for 3,000 years should be replaced by a hollow shell of plaster." Miss Hartley nodded gently. Her needles began to click once more. "How very strange," Miss Hartley murmured, "that a stone should lose its soul. In St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Gudgeon used to say that when a churchwarden begins to talk in parables, it is usually because he has found something in the parish accounts that he is too polite to mention in plain English." Chapter 3. The Appraiser's Alibi. Exhibit 3C, Faience Amulet of the Eye of Horus. Brilliant, turquoise glazed ceramic. Dynasty 21, circa 1000 BCE. Presented by the Society of Biblical Archaeology, 1908. Catalogued weight, 3.4 ounces. By Thursday morning, Inspector Bradley's comfortable theory of an accidental cardiac seizure was severely shaken by the discovery of a bitter, public altercation that had occurred within the museum 48 hours prior to the tragedy. The information was brought to the police station by Mr. Thwaite, the museum's honorary solicitor and treasurer. Mr. Thwaite, the museum solicitor, was a dry, precise gentleman of 65, with gold-rimmed pince-nez, a spotless gray waistcoat, and an immense sense of fiduciary responsibility. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, tapping a sheaf of legal documents against his knuckles. "Let us be entirely candid about the financial realities of this institution, Inspector Bradley," Mr. Thwaite said, his voice measured and grave. "The Calloway Museum is not a wealthy national institution like the British Museum or the Victoria and Albert. We rely upon a modest municipal grant from the Borough Council, supplemented by private endowments from the Calloway and Hartwell families. In 1949, the roof of the Roman Gallery required extensive timber repairs costing over £3,000, which severely depleted our capital reserves. When Dr. Croft proposed the complete reorganization of the Egyptian wing, he assured the Board of Trustees that the exhibition would attract scholars and visitors from all over the world, thereby restoring our finances." "And the insurance policy, Mr. Thwaite?" Miss Hartley inquired gently. "Ah," Thwaite said, adjusting his spectacles, "a most important point. 6 months ago, upon Dr. Croft's formal recommendation, the board increased the insurance coverage on the Egyptian collection from £20,000 to £65,000, underwritten by Lloyd's of London." Croft explained that recent auction prices in New York and Paris had doubled the market value of Dynasty 18 and 19 artifacts, and that it would be gross negligence to leave the collection underinsured. "How very prudent," Miss Hartley murmured, "and so convenient if a disaster should ever befall the gallery." Mr. Oliver Dench, the visiting appraiser from London, was formally summoned to the curator's study for interrogation. Dench was a stocky, combative gentleman of 52, with iron-gray hair, a florid complexion, and a sharp, cynical manner, honed by 30 years of auction-room warfare in Bond Street. Dressed in a loud check waistcoat and a heavy tweed ulster, he sat in the armchair, with his arms folded, glaring at Inspector Bradley with open derision. "Yes, Inspector," Dench barked, biting the end of the cigar. "I had words with Sidney Orth on Monday afternoon. I told him he was a blind old fool who couldn't tell the difference between a genuine Middle Kingdom scarab and a piece of carved soapstone from a souvenir shop in Cairo. What of it? Is it a capital crime in Berkshire to tell an ignorant watchman the truth about a museum display?" "What were you arguing about, Mr. Dench?" Bradley asked, leaning across the desk. "I was looking at the Dynasty 18 vitrine," Dench replied, tapping his lighter against his thumb. "The alabaster Canopic Jar, presented by the Hartwell estate in 1912. I've known that piece for 20 years. I valued it for probate when old Colonel Hartwell died. The original jar had a distinct deep green veining running through the calcite base, and a small chip on the left ear of the baboon head. The jar sitting in that case on Monday had no veining whatsoever, and the baboon ear was as smooth as a new sixpence. I told Orff that someone had substituted a modern plaster copy for the original piece, and that the museum was displaying worthless rubbish." "And what did Orff say?" Bradley demanded. "The old fool flew into a rage," Dench said. "He told me Dr. Croft was the finest scholar in England, and that I was an insolent tradesman who had no business insulting the collection. He said he'd prove the piece was genuine if he had to weigh every stone in the building with his own hands." Inspector Bradley's eyes widened. "And where were you on Tuesday night, Mr. Dench, between 10 o'clock and dawn?" Dench laughed a loud, barking laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "I was at the Athenaeum Club in Pall Mall, Inspector. I took the 5:40 train from Calloway Station on Tuesday afternoon. I dined at the club at 8 with Professor Hetherington of the British Museum and Sir Arthur Glanville of the Antiquities Trust. We played bridge in the card room until 1:30 in the morning, and I slept in bedroom 14 on the 3rd floor. You can telephone the club porter and verify every single minute of my evening. Consider the financial stakes of international antiquities collecting, Inspector," Dench remarked, leaning back in his chair with a sardonic grin. "In the years since the war, the great private fortunes of Texas oilmen, Swiss bankers, and South American industrialists have poured into the art market. A genuine Dynasty 18 Canopic Jar that brought £500 in 1930 will easily fetch 4,000 guineas in a private room in Zurich today. A monumental limestone relief of the Amarna period is virtually unobtainable by legitimate means, because the Egyptian government placed an absolute embargo on the export of antiquities in 1936. When supply is legally frozen and demand is unlimited, the temptation for an unscrupulous insider with access to museum vaults is almost beyond human resistance. A telephone call placed by Inspector Bradley to the Athenaeum Club confirmed Dench's statement in every particular. Professor Hetherington and the club steward verified that Oliver Dench had never left Pall Mall between 7 in the evening and 8 the following morning. Dench rose from his chair, dusting his cigar ash onto the hearth. "So you see, Inspector," Dench said with a sneer, "your watchman was not killed by a wandering scholar. But I give you this piece of advice for nothing. If you want to know why Sidney Orff was lying on that floor with a spring balance beside his hand, you go into that gallery and take a penknife to the base of that canopic jar. You'll find it's made of fine dental plaster, painted with shellac and weighted with sand. Let me tell you something about Egyptian calcite, Inspector," Dench continued, leaning forward with his cigar glowing red in the dim room. "True Oriental alabaster calcite from the ancient quarries of Hatnub is a heavy, dense, crystalline calcium carbonate with a specific gravity of nearly 2.8. It feels cold to the touch, like mountain ice, and it rings with a clear, bell-like chime when you tap it with an ivory paper knife. But dental plaster, even when mixed with ground barytes and coated with shellac, has a dull, thudding resonance and a specific gravity of less than 1.4. A child who has played with clay could tell the difference in the dark." He puffed a thick cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Sidney Orff wasn't a scholar, Inspector, but he was an honest man who had dusted those cases for 22 years. He knew the heft of every stone in his gallery. And when I pointed out the flaws in that baboon jar, I saw the blood leave his face. He looked at that case as if he were seeing a ghost. 'Mr. Dench,' he said to me, 'if what you're saying is true, then 30 years of my life have been a lie.' And he walked away down the corridor with his head bowed, looking like an old soldier whose regiment had disgraced its colors. He marched out of the room, leaving Inspector Bradley in a state of profound, bewildered alarm. Miss Hartley, who had listened to every word with her hands resting upon her reticule, looked out through the tall windows toward the quiet gardens. "How very interesting," Miss Hartley murmured softly. "Mr. Dench was not threatening Sidney Orff on Monday afternoon. He was warning him. And Sidney Orff, who loved this museum with all his heart, took that warning into the quiet of the night, with his balance and his catalogue, to see if the terrible thing could possibly be true." Chapter 4. The Ushabti Figurine. Exhibit 4D, Ushabti Figurine of Senefer, Overseer of the Royal Granaries. Glazed steatite with 7 lines of Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead. Dynasty 18, circa 1400 BCE. Acquired 1922. Catalogued weight, 1 pound, 6 ounces. On Thursday afternoon, while Inspector Bradley was at the police station, telephoning the Home Office Forensic Laboratory, Miss Hartley sat with Miss Evelyn Price in the museum's cataloging office on the mezzanine floor. The room was filled with the pleasant dusty scent of old paper, binding glue, and library paste. Spread out upon the long oak table were 4 successive editions of the Calloway Museum Guide and Inventory, spanning the years from 1930 to the current autumn. With her lace inspection magnifying glass held in her hand, Miss Hartley was conducting a meticulous comparison between the old inventory registers and the new terracotta-covered exhibition catalogue prepared by Dr. Raymond Croft. "Look closely here, Miss Price," Miss Hartley said softly, pointing the tip of her pencil at page 18 of the current catalogue. Under the 10-power lens, the printed surface of page 18 revealed a curious irregularity. Over the original printed text for Exhibit 4D, the Ushabti Figurine of Senefer, a narrow slip of heavy cream paper had been neatly pasted, printed in a typeface that matched the surrounding text almost, but not quite perfectly. The ink on the pasted slip was a slightly denser carbon black, and the font was a modern Gill Sans, whereas the original volume had been set in monotype Baskerville. The pasted slip read, "Catalogued weight, 1 pound 6 ounces." Miss Hartley turned back to the 1938 bound inventory register. There, in the original copperplate handwriting of Croft's predecessor, the entry for the very same Ushabti figurine read, "Steatite funerary figure of Senefer, solid dense soapstone. Weight, 3 pounds 8 ounces." Miss Price leaned forward, her spectacles sliding down her nose as she stared at the two entries. 2 pounds and 2 ounces lighter, Miss Price whispered in bewilderment. How could an ancient stone figurine lose 2 pounds in 14 years? It could not, my dear, Miss Hartley replied with quiet certainty. A block of solid Egyptian steatite does not evaporate with time. But a hollow replica, cast in fine dental plaster, painted with mineral pigments, and coated with a thin wash of amber resin, weighs precisely 1 pound 6 ounces. And look at Exhibit 2B, the baboon-headed Canopic Jar. In the 1938 ledger, its weight is recorded as 11 pounds 4 ounces. In Dr. Croft's new catalogue, the pasted slip gives the weight as 5 pounds 2 ounces. And Exhibit 1A, the great limestone relief, its weight has been reduced by nearly half. Merciful heavens, Miss Price breathed, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Every single major piece in the new exhibition has had its catalogued weight altered. Yes, Miss Hartley said, her blue eyes darkening with deep, sorrowful comprehension. Whoever replaced the genuine antiquities with plaster copies was a meticulous scholar who understood that if an outside inspector or appraiser ever weighed the collection, the discrepancies would immediately expose the fraud. Therefore, he reprinted the catalogue labels, systematically reducing the recorded weights to match the exact weights of the plaster replicas he had manufactured. He altered the official record of the museum to fit the lie he had placed in the display cases. Miss Hartley turned the vellum leaves of the 1922 guide, her magnifying glass hovering over the acquisition numbers. Consider the psychology of an institutional catalogue, Miss Evelyn, Miss Hartley remarked, her needles clicking with gentle rhythm. A printed catalogue is the public conscience of a museum. It tells the trustees, the donors, and the world exactly what treasures are held in trust for future generations. When a man wishes to steal an individual jewel from a drawing room, he simply takes it and hopes no one will notice for a few weeks. But when a man decides to steal an entire museum collection, over 3 years, he cannot afford to leave the original catalogue entries standing. If the book says a stone relief weighs 10 pounds, and an inquisitive visitor notices that it feels like 5, the game is up. He must alter the book itself. He must turn the official printed record into an accomplice to his theft. And there is another thing to consider, Miss Evelyn, Miss Hartley remarked, pointing her pencil toward the door that led to the lower printing room. Whoever printed these small paper slips did not send the job to a commercial printer in the high street. A commercial printer would have kept a job ticket and entered the order in his daybook. He used the small Albion hand press that stands in the museum basement, the press used by the staff for printing gallery notices and lecture programs. If we examine the typecases in the basement, we will undoubtedly find the font of Gill Sans capitals. And upon the inking stone, we will find fresh traces of the very same carbon black printing ink that was used on these slips. Miss Price nodded slowly, her face pale with growing comprehension. Dr. Croft has had the key to the printing room in his pocket for the past 3 weeks. He said he was preparing the proofs for the annual report. Precisely, Miss Hartley said softly. The criminal always leaves his tools close at hand, because he cannot bear the thought of entrusting any part of his secret to an outsider. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Hartley explained, turning another leaf of the 1938 catalogue, When old Mr. Crump the butcher was suspected of altering his weight receipts for prime beef, everyone looked at the scales in his shop. But it was my dear mother who noticed that the bills sent out to the manor house were written on paper with a slightly different watermark from the bills sent to the vicarage. When people are engaged in a long-term deception, they invariably create two sets of books, one for the truth and one for the world. And the most dangerous moment for the deceiver is when the two sets of records accidentally meet upon the same table. Miss Price looked at Miss Hartley with profound, wide-eyed admiration. "You understand human nature so completely, Miss Hartley." "Human nature, my dear," Miss Hartley replied with a gentle smile, "is very much the same whether one is dealing with prime sirloin in Hampshire or ancient pharaohs in Berkshire. The motives are always vanity, fear, or money." Miss Hartley closed the catalogue, smoothing its terracotta cover with her gloved hand. "And Sidney Orff," Miss Hartley added softly, "with his 30 years of habit, his little brass spring balance, and his clocking-in key, began to weigh the cases on Tuesday night. He found that the stone had indeed lost its soul, and when he went to tell the man who had written the book, he walked straight into the executioner's chamber." Chapter 5. The Gilded Cartonnage. Exhibit 5E. Mummy cartonnage panel depicting Anubis leading the deceased. Gesso on laminated linen with brilliant mineral pigments and pure gold leaf. Late period, circa 350 BCE. Presented by the Countess of Berkshire, 1928. Catalogued weight, 8 pounds 10 ounces. The arrival of Dr. Thorne's comprehensive post-mortem report on Friday morning shattered the last remaining illusion of an accidental death. Dr. Thorne, a precise, white-haired physician who had served as county coroner's pathologist for 30 years, laid out a diagram of the human respiratory system beside the toxicological report. "The lethal properties of hydrocyanic acid gas, ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Thorne explained, his voice clinical and dispassionate, "are among the most catastrophic known to medical science. When an ampoule of concentrated prussic acid is crushed within 6 inches of the face, the volatile liquid vaporizes instantaneously at room temperature. The victim inhales a concentration of several thousand parts per million. The cyanide ions immediately bind to the ferric iron in the cytochrome oxidase enzymes of every cell in the body, completely arresting cellular respiration. The brain is starved of oxygen within 5 seconds. There is no time for the heart to race, no time for the muscles to convulse. The victim simply ceases to function, collapsing where he stands with the suddenness of an electric circuit being disconnected." "And the murderer?" Miss Hartley asked. "Did he not risk inhaling the fumes himself?" "Not if he held his breath and stepped backward immediately," Dr. Thorne replied. "Or if he wore a simple rubber mask with a charcoal filter, such as are used in chemical laboratories. The gallery is vast and high-ceilinged. The small cloud of gas would disperse into the upper air within 2 minutes, leaving only the faintest residue of bitter almonds upon the victim's clothing." Inspector Bradley summoned Miss Hartley, Mrs. Vera Hartwell, Thwaite to the museum boardroom to hear the medical findings. "It was not heart failure," Inspector Bradley announced grimly, laying the typed Home Office report upon the mahogany conference table. "Dr. Thorne and the Home Office toxicologist have concluded their analysis. Sidney Orff was murdered by the inhalation of concentrated hydrocyanic acid gas, prussic acid. Concentrated hydrocyanic acid gas." A collective gasp echoed through the paneled room. "Hydrocyanic acid?" Mrs. Hartwell exclaimed, clutching her pearls. "How could such a terrible poison be administered to a man making his rounds in an open gallery?" "The method was diabolically simple and terrifyingly swift," Bradley explained. "Beneath the dead man's left collarbone, pinned to the wool of his watchman's coat, Dr. Thorne found the fragments of a microscopic glass ampule, the kind used by chemical laboratories for containing volatile test liquids. The ampule had been crushed against his chest with a gloved thumb. A single inhalation of the concentrated prussic gas produced instant paralysis of the respiratory centers. Death occurred in less than 10 seconds. The victim had no time to cry out, no time to struggle. He simply sank to his knees and expired. And the glass case beside him? Mr. Thwaite asked, his legal mind grasping the implications. Why was he found beside the sarcophagus of Horjed Ptah? Because, Miss Hartley said in her quiet, unhurried voice, the sarcophagus was the grandest, most valuable object in the entire museum, and the one whose weight Sidney Orff had resolved to test with his own hands on Tuesday night. Whoever killed him did not choose that spot by chance. He followed Sidney into the gallery in the dark. He waited until the old man was kneeling beside the case with his balance and his catalogue, and then he stepped out from the shadows and crushed the glass ampoule beneath his chin. And the murderer, Bradley said, his jaw tightening, had access to laboratory chemicals, understood toxicological dosages, and possessed keys to every inner door in this building. And more than that, Inspector, Miss Hartley remarked with gentle emphasis, the murderer was someone whom Sidney Orff knew and trusted completely. If a stranger or a burglar had approached him in the dark gallery at 2 in the morning, Sidney would have raised his heavy brass clocking-in key to defend himself, or blown the police whistle that hung from his lanyard. But Sidney's whistle remained in his pocket, and his key lay loosely in his fingers. He did not defend himself, because the person who walked up to him was the very man whose scholarship he had revered for 20 years. Chapter 6. The Bronze Statuette. Exhibit 6F. Bronze Statuette of Osiris, King of the Underworld and Judge of the Dead. Solid cast bronze with incised detailing and electrum inlay. New Kingdom, circa 1200 BCE. Presented from the Lord Calloway bequest, 1894. Catalogued weight, 14 pounds 4 ounces. The final link in the operational mechanics of the theft was provided on Friday afternoon by Mrs. Batty, the senior cleaning attendant. Mrs. Batty was a cheerful, stout woman of 60, with red, soapy arms, a floral headscarf, and an unshakable belief that a good cup of strong tea and 3 tablespoons of washing soda could cure all the evils of the British Empire. Miss Hartley found her in the basement boiler room, where she was busily boiling a copper of dusting cloths. "A dreadful business, Miss Hartley," Mrs. Batty said, wiping her face with the corner of her apron, as she poured 2 cups of tea from a brown earthenware pot. "Poor Sidney, as honest an old soul as ever walked in shoe leather. Always complaining about my floor polish, mind you, but never a hard work for anyone. Mrs. Batty, he'd say to me, you keep them parquet floors so slippery a mummy could dance the polka on 'em. And now to think he's gone, and the police turning the whole place upside down." "You have kept these floors in immaculate condition for many years, Mrs. Batty," Miss Hartley said, with warm, sincere admiration. "Such heavy work, carrying the polishers and the brushes up those grand stone stairs." "Ah, well, we have the cleaning cart, you see, ma'am," Mrs. Batty replied, pointing toward a large 4-wheeled wooden box cart that stood in the corner of the boiler room. The cart was constructed of heavy oak boards, fitted with rubber-tired wheels, and measured nearly 4 feet in length by 2 feet in depth. The great box cart has a top tray for the mops and pails, and a big locked cupboard underneath where we keep the 5-gallon tins of wax and the electric polishing drums. Only the cupboard hasn't been used for wax these last 2 years. Miss Hartley set down her teacup, her blue eyes fixing upon the wooden cart with sudden, intense concentration. "And why has the cupboard not been used for wax, Mrs. Batty?" "Because Dr. Croft took the key for his own research, ma'am," Mrs. Batty said. 2 years ago, when he began the alterations in the Egyptian wing, Dr. Croft told me that the damp in the basement was bad for his packing crates. He said he'd use the bottom of the cleaning cart to move his delicate plaster casting models from his study down to the side courtyard where his motor car was parked. Many a time I've seen him pushing that heavy cart down the service ramp at 7 in the evening, after all the visitors had gone home. And did you see him with the cart on Tuesday evening, before the museum closed for the night? Miss Hartley inquired softly. Why, yes, ma'am, Mrs. Batty said, nodding vigorously. At 6:30 on Tuesday, just before the private view began. I was coming out of the ladies' cloakroom on the ground floor, and there was Dr. Croft pushing the cart out of the Egyptian gallery corridor. It was heavy, too. I could hear the springs creaking under the weight. I offered to give him a hand with it, but he went as white as a sheet, snapped at me like a terrier, and told me to mind my own business and get on with the tea trays. A gentleman like Dr. Croft losing his temper over a cleaning cart. I was that surprised I nearly dropped my kettle. And another thing, Miss Hartley, Mrs. Batty added, leaning across the scrubbed wooden table with her teacup clutched in her red hands. Dr. Croft changed. 3 years ago, he was a pleasant, quiet gentleman who'd always pass the time of day, ask after my rheumatism, and give me 10 shillings for Christmas. But these last 2 years, he grew that nervous and jumpy, you couldn't drop a teaspoon without him leaping out of his chair. He started locking his study door even when he just went down the hall to wash his hands. And whenever a strange gentleman in a dark overcoat came to see him from London, he'd draw the green velvet curtains and speak in whispers. Mrs. Batty, Sidney said to me only last month, there's something eating Dr. Croft from the inside out. He looks like a man who's waiting for a thunderbolt to fall from a clear sky. And Sidney was right, poor soul. Sidney was always right. Miss Hartley rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly with the profound, sorrowful certainty that had taken possession of her mind. Thank you, Mrs. Batty, Miss Hartley said gently. You have been extraordinarily helpful. You have explained how 20 ancient Egyptian treasures left this building without a single alarm being raised or a single window broken. As Miss Hartley walked up the basement stairs into the silent entrance hall, the pieces of the puzzle fell into their final, inescapable alignment. The cleaning cart with its deep locked compartment, the heavy weight pushed down the service ramp at dusk, the motor car waiting in the private courtyard, the reprinted catalogue slips with their reduced weights, the altered Canopic Jar, and the crushed glass ampule of prussic acid beside the sarcophagus. It was not the curse of a pharaoh 3,000 years dead. It was the ancient squalid curse of human greed and intellectual pride, practiced by a living scholar who had traded his honor for gold, and who had murdered an innocent old man to keep the world from knowing that his museum was filled with hollow plaster and painted dust. Chapter 7. The Weight of Things. Exhibit 7G. Limestone relief depicting Akhenaten and Nefertiti offering to the Aten. Carved fine white Tura limestone with sunk relief carving. Dynasty 18, Amarna period, circa 1345 BCE. Acquired 1925. Catalogued weight 4 pounds 2 ounces. The decisive documentary evidence that converted suspicion into mathematical certainty was discovered late on Friday afternoon in Sidney Orf's private watchman's locker in the basement staff room. Inspector Bradley had already searched the locker for stolen keys or pawn tickets, finding only an extra pair of woolen socks, a tin of peppermint lozenges, and a spare collar. But Miss Hartley, who understood that an old man's habits are the truest reflection of his soul, had asked to examine the locker once more in the company of Miss Evelyn Price. At the very back of the narrow steel locker, tucked behind a copy of the Berkshire Chronicle from 1949, Miss Hartley's fingers found a small, thick, cloth-bound notebook with marbled edges and a red spine, the sort used by railway tally clerks for recording wagon weights. Across the front cover, written in Sidney Orf's neat, old-fashioned schoolbook hand, were the words, S. Orf, Personal Weight and Measure Record of Gallery Contents, 1930 to 1952. Miss Hartley carried the volume to the table beneath the gas lamp. The notebook was an extraordinary monument to 30 years of patient, unrewarded vigilance. To an impatient scholar or a casual visitor, it might have appeared as nothing more than the tedious hobby of an elderly eccentric with too many empty night hours upon his hands. But to Miss Hartley, who knew how the quiet people of the world often build their lives around small, unshakable duties, those yellowed leaves represented something sacred. The inviolable trust of an honest custodian who believed that every antiquity committed to his care was a living trust between the dead past and the unborn future. Every single stone, bronze, and ceramic object in the Calloway Museum was entered in chronological sequence, accompanied by 3 distinct columns of figures, the dimensions in inches and eighths, the tare weight of the display bracket, and the exact net weight of the artifact, recorded to the nearest quarter of an ounce with the aid of his brass spring balance. Miss Hartley turned to the pages devoted to the Egyptian antiquities collection. Beginning in November 1949, Sydney's pencil annotations underwent a dramatic, chilling transformation. Beside the entry for Exhibit 2B, the baboon-headed Canopic Jar, Sydney had written in red ink on 14 November 1949, reweighed after Dr. Croft's cleaning. Old weight, 11 pounds 4 ounces. Present weight, 5 pounds 2 ounces. Deficit, 6 pounds 2 ounces. Jar feels smooth like plaster. Asked Dr. Croft if stone had dried out. Dr. C said, Egyptian alabaster loses moisture when heated by electric display lamps. Query, can stone lose half its weight without shrinking? Beside the entry for Exhibit 4D, the Ushabti of Senefer, dated 8 March 1950. Old weight, 3 pounds 8 ounces. Present weight, 1 pound 6 ounces. Figurine sounds hollow when tapped with thumbnail. Dr. C says internal core decayed by salt efflorescence. Beside Exhibit 6F, the Bronze Statuette of Osiris, dated 12 September 1951. Old weight, 14 pounds 4 ounces. Present weight, 5 pounds 8 ounces. Metal feels warm to touch. Says, alloy was porous casting filled with ancient resin that evaporated. And finally, on page 42, dated Tuesday 25 November 1952, the very night of his death, was a single, heavily underlined entry written in trembling, agitated pencil. Weighed limestone relief of Akhenaten before the private view. True limestone weight is 10 pounds. Present weight, 4 pounds 2 ounces. Plaster cast painted with gouache. Dr. Croft has lied to me for 3 years. The entire collection has been stolen. I have taken the new catalogue and my balance to the gallery. I will wait by the sarcophagus until he comes down, and I will demand the truth before God and the trustees. Miss Evelyn Price stared at the trembling pencil lines, tears falling unchecked upon the open page. He knew, Miss Price whispered in a broken voice. Sydney knew everything. He waited for Dr. Croft in the dark to give him a chance to confess, and Dr. Croft brought the poison. Yes, Miss Hartley said, her voice filled with an immense, quiet sorrow. An honest man who loved his work could not conceive that a gentleman of learning, a scholar whom he had admired for 20 years, would choose to commit murder rather than face the humiliation of exposure. Sydney Orfe believed that truth had only to be spoken to be honored. He did not understand that to a vain, ambitious man, truth is the one thing more terrifying than death itself. Chapter 8. The Dealer's Correspondence. Exhibit 8H. Papyrus fragment containing spell 125 from the Book of the Dead of the royal scribe Ani. Ink on laminated Cyprus papyrus. Dynasty 19, circa 1275 BCE. Acquired 1910. Catalog dimensions, 14 inches by 9 inches. The final documentary chain connecting Dr. Raymond Croft to the international traffic in stolen antiquities was assembled within 2 hours of the discovery of Sydney Orphe's notebook. Accompanied by Inspector Bradley and Mr. Thwaite, Miss Hartley entered the curator's study. While Dr. Croft was detained in the lower committee room under the pretext of signing formal insurance declarations, Inspector Bradley executed a comprehensive search of the office. Behind the rows of German archaeological folios on the third shelf, hidden within a hollowed-out bound volume of the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology for 1935, they discovered a locked metal dispatch box. Miss Hartley produced her silver-plated steel hairpin. With 2 deft, practiced rotations against the brass tumblers, the lock clicked back. Inside the box lay the complete operational archive of Dr. Croft's 3-year criminal enterprise. There were 17 receipted bank drafts drawn on the Union Bank of Switzerland in Zurich, totaling £28,400 sterling, made payable to a private account under the name of Dr. R.C. Crawford. There was a series of typed letters on the embossed stationery of Messrs. Van Houten and Zoon, Antiquaires, Rokin 42, Amsterdam, confirming the safe delivery and private sale of 21 genuine Egyptian antiquities from the Calloway Museum to private collectors in New York, Zurich, and Buenos Aires. The letters revealed the monstrous systematic brilliance of the scheme. Every 6 months, Dr. Croft had selected one major artifact from the museum's vaults. Working late at night in his private laboratory on the mezzanine, he had created a master silicone mold of the original antiquity, had cast an exact replica in high-density dental plaster, and had painted the surface with mineral pigments and antique amber shellac to replicate the exact patina of ancient stone, bronze, or faience. He had then packed the genuine ancient masterpiece into the bottom compartment of the heavy wooden cleaning cart, had wheeled it down the service ramp to his motor car at dusk, and had shipped it from Dover to Amsterdam inside wooden crates marked Plaster Educational Reproductions for University Teaching Collections. To protect the fraud against casual inspection, Croft had used the museum's hand press to print revised catalog slips, systematically reducing the printed weights in the official guide to match the lighter weights of the plaster replicas. And the final letter in the dispatch box, dated only 6 days earlier from Amsterdam, contained the ultimate catastrophic incentive that had driven him to murder. Dear Dr. Croft, we have secured a private buyer in Philadelphia who is prepared to pay $25,000 for the limestone sarcophagus relief of Hor Jed Ptah, provided the piece can be delivered in London before the 1st of December. We await your confirmation. The correspondence with Messrs. Van Houten in Amsterdam detailed the exact logistics of the international smuggling pipeline. The antiquities, once removed from the museum in the bottom of the cleaning cart, were transferred to the boot of Dr. Croft's dark green Riley saloon car in the secluded courtyard behind the boiler house. On Friday afternoons, Croft would drive down to Dover, where the wooden packing crates bearing official forged export certificates from the British Archaeological Reproduction Society were loaded onto the cross-channel cargo steamers for Ostend and Rotterdam. From Rotterdam, the crates were transported by bonded rail van to the customs warehouse in Amsterdam, where the dealer, Herr Hendrik van Houten, arranged the falsified provenance papers, attributing the antiquities to an old private collection in the Levant, formed before 1914. From Amsterdam, the treasures were dispersed to private collectors across the globe, while the purchase funds were deposited into Croft's numbered account at the Union Bank of Switzerland in Zurich. It was an international conspiracy executed with the flawless administrative precision of an Oxford scholar who had turned his intellect to the service of crime. The ledger of private sales contained in the dispatch box read like the inventory of an imperial treasury. Baboon Canopic Jar of Happy, sold to Herr K. von Bern, Zurich, for £3,500 sterling. Steatite Ushabti of Senefer, sold to M. Dupont, Geneva, for £1,200. Bronze Statuette of Osiris, sold to Mr. C. Vanderveer, New York, for £4,800. Limestone relief of Akhenaten, sold to Don R. Martinez, Buenos Aires, for £6,200. Cartonnage panel of Anubis, sold to Sir H. Braithwaite, Nassau, for £2,800. Every single transaction was documented with its date of transfer, the shipping docket number, and the corresponding credit advice from the Union Bank in Zurich. It was the complete financial anatomy of a 3-year betrayal. Inspector Bradley slammed the dispatch box shut, his face white with righteous fury. £28,000, Bradley breathed. And a murder committed for another 5,000. A scholar of Oxford University selling the heritage of England to foreign millionaires. Not for the money alone, Inspector, Miss Hartley said softly, looking at the handsome leather-bound books and the delicate bronze artifacts upon the desk. In St. Mary Mead, our old organist, Mr. Haydock, spent 20 years stealing from the choir fund, not because he was poor, but because he could not bear the thought that his rival in the next parish had a grander piano than his own. When intellectual pride is wounded by envy, there is no crime too monstrous for a clever man to justify to his own conscience. Miss Hartley drew her woolen shawl around her shoulders. "And now, Inspector," she said quietly, "let us go down to the committee room. It is time for Dr. Raymond Croft to look upon the work of his own hands." Chapter 9. The Curator's Study. Exhibit 9I, Crushed Glass Laboratory Ampoule, Borosilicate Microcapsule, Residual Contents, Concentrated Hydrocyanic Acid, Prussic Acid, recovered from the Egyptian Gallery, Plinth, 1952. Catalogued location, Forensic Evidence Archive. At 6 o'clock on Friday evening, while the rain beat upon the high skylights of the museum, and the cathedral bells of Calloway chimed the hour of 6 across the mist-shrouded close, Miss Judith Hartley sat alone in the curator's study. The vast room, usually so imposing with its towering ranks of leather-bound German archaeological treatises and its casts of ancient stelae, seemed to have contracted into a small, shadowed chamber of judgment. A modest coal fire burned in the grate, casting a soft, flickering glow across the dark mahogany bookcases and the ancient stone reliefs mounted upon the walls. The heavy oak door opened, and Dr. Raymond Croft stepped into the room. He had removed his overcoat, dressed in his brown tweed suit, his gold watch chain gleaming across his waistcoat. He carried an air of exhausted, defensive dignity. He looked at Miss Hartley, who sat quietly by the hearth, with her knitting needles resting in her lap, and offered a faint, strained smile. "Miss Hartley," Croft said, closing the door behind him, and walking to his desk. "Miss Price informed me you were waiting here. I trust Inspector Bradley has concluded his rather tedious interrogations for the evening. It has been a most distressing ordeal for all of us." "Inspector Bradley is at this moment in the committee room, Dr. Croft," Miss Hartley replied, her voice soft, gentle, and utterly unhurried, examining the dispatch box that was hidden behind the folios of the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology on your third shelf. Dr. Croft froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the bronze scarab paperweight, remained suspended in mid-air, above the leather blotter. The faint, polite smile vanished from his face with the sudden, absolute finality of a snuffed candle. The room fell into an immense, terrifying silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the coal settling in the grate. Miss Hartley reached into her reticule. She laid 3 objects upon the green leather blotter directly before the curator. The first was the printed exhibition catalogue, open to the altered weight slip for Exhibit 4D. The second was the fragment of microscopic glass found pinned to Sidney Orff's coat. The third was Sidney Orff's cloth-bound weight and measure notebook, open to page 42. "It is over, Dr. Croft," Miss Hartley said, looking at him with eyes full of deep, sorrowful compassion. The Swiss bank drafts, the letters from Messrs. Van Houten in Amsterdam, the altered catalogue slips, and Sidney Orff's 30 years of records. There is not a single stone left in your wall of defense. Dr. Croft stood utterly motionless for a long, agonizing minute. Then, with a slow, shuddering sigh that seemed to drain the last remaining vitality from his frame, he sank down into his leather armchair. He removed his gold-rimmed spectacles, laying them upon the desk with fingers that trembled uncontrollably. Without them, his face looked hollow, aged, and stripped of every vestige of academic pride. 20 years, Miss Hartley, Croft whispered, his voice dry and hoarse as ancient papyrus. 20 years of being regarded as a second-rate provincial curator by men who possess not a tenth of my knowledge. In 1932, when the chair of Egyptology at Oxford became vacant, Professor Hetherington, that pompous, arrogant charlatan who has never spent an hour in a desert excavation, used his family influence to take the appointment from under my feet. He told the election board that Raymond Croft was a competent technician, but lacked the broad intellectual vision required for high academic office. He clenched his fists upon the desk, his eyes burning with the accumulated bitterness of 2 decades. I spent 10 years in Egypt, Miss Hartley. I translated the inscriptions of the Valley of the Kings, while Hetherington was drinking port in his college rooms. And when I came to this miserable provincial museum, I was paid £400 a year, while Hetherington lectured in London for 50 guineas an afternoon. I swore to myself that I would have my revenge, that I would build a fortune so vast that I could buy and sell every member of the Antiquities Trust. And so you began to copy the artifacts, Miss Hartley said softly. It was an art, Miss Hartley, Croft said, a feverish, horrifying pride breaking through his despair. No ordinary thief could have done what I did. I made the molds with my own hands. I mixed the dental plaster with ground slate and alabaster dust to match the density. I spent 3 months mastering the chemical patinas to reproduce the mineral bloom on bronze and the ancient calcite veining. The greatest experts in London walked through that gallery and never suspected a thing. My copies were more beautiful than the originals. And the genuine pieces? Miss Hartley asked. They are in private collections, Croft whispered. In Zurich, in New York, in Buenos Aires, safely preserved in air-conditioned vaults, cherished by connoisseurs who paid £28,000 to possess them. I took nothing that was harmed. I merely transferred the heritage of the past into hands that truly appreciated its value. And what of Sidney Orff, Dr. Croft? Miss Hartley asked, her voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper. Did he appreciate your art when you crushed the prussic acid ampule against his heart? Croft flinched, as though a whip had struck his cheek. He buried his face in his hands, his breath coming in ragged, broken sobs. He came to this office at 10 o'clock on Tuesday night, Croft murmured, his voice muffled by his palms. He had the catalogue in his hand. He laid his brass spring balance on this very desk. He said, Dr. Croft, the baboon jar weighs 5 pounds instead of 11. The Ushabti Figurine sounds hollow, and the limestone relief of Akhenaten is made of painted plaster. You're a thief, sir, and you've stolen the treasures of Calloway. I begged him. I offered him £5,000 in cash. I told him we could leave the country together. He lowered his hands, looking at Miss Hartley with haunted, feverish eyes. He looked at me with those cold, honest eyes, Croft whispered. He said, I've guarded this building for 22 years, Dr. Croft. I took my oath to the trustees and to the Queen. If I took a single sovereign of your stolen gold, I couldn't look my grandchildren in the face. He picked up his catalogue and his balance, and he walked out into the gallery. He said he was going to wait by the sarcophagus until the police arrived in the morning. Croft shuddered violently, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk. I had the ampule in my chemical cabinet, he said, speaking in a flat, mechanical monotone. I had prepared it 6 months ago for killing specimen beetles for the entomology display. I followed him down the gallery in the dark. He was kneeling beside the sarcophagus, testing the weight of the plinth. I stepped up behind him. I said, "Sidney, look at this inscription." When he turned his face toward me, I crushed the glass beneath his chin. He took one breath, and he was gone. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against the green leather blotter. "I didn't want to kill him," Croft wept. "God knows I didn't want to kill him. But the lie had grown too large. I was trapped inside my own creation, and I could not stop." Miss Hartley sat in the silent room, looking at the broken scholar with profound, unyielding moral clarity. "You spoke of your art, Dr. Croft," Miss Hartley said, her voice quiet, steady, and devastating in its moral clarity. "You spoke with pride of your silicone molds, your chemical patinas, and the beauty of your plaster copies. But you forgot that an ancient work of art is not merely a shape or a color. It is the living spirit of the craftsman who carved it 3,000 years ago with his sweat, his prayers, and his faith. When you took the genuine stone of Horjed Ptah and replaced it with painted plaster, you did not create art. You created an empty lie. And when that lie was challenged by the simple honesty of an old watchman with a spring balance, your great scholarship collapsed into a squalid, cowardly murder in the dark." Croft wept openly, his tears soaking into the green leather of the desk. "I thought I was above them all," he sobbed. "I thought I was smarter than Hetherington, smarter than the trustees, smarter than the police. And now I am a murderer, and my name will be reviled wherever scholars meet." "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Hartley said, her mild blue eyes resting upon the broken curator with infinite sadness, "our dear old Dr. Haydock always says that the most dangerous disease of the human mind is not madness, but pride, the terrible delusion that because a man knows Greek and Latin and has deciphered ancient inscriptions, he is exempt from the 10 Commandments. But God is not mocked, Dr. Croft. The laws of truth and justice are as unchangeable as the granite of the pyramids, and when a man chooses to betray them, the weight of his own falsehood will inevitably crush him to powder." She rose from her chair, drawing her woolen cape around her shoulders. The heavy study door clicked open, and Inspector Bradley entered, followed by 2 uniformed constables. Dr. Raymond Croft did not resist. He rose from his chair, put on his overcoat, and walked out into the cold November rain to answer for his crime. Chapter 10. The Sealed Collection. Exhibit 10J, the empty display case. Polished teak and plate glass, formerly containing the royal antiquities of Horjed Ptah, to be restored upon the recovery of the original treasures. On Saturday morning, the Calloway Municipal Museum stood in the pale autumn sunlight, its great wrought-iron gates closed and sealed by order of the Home Office and the High Court. In Mrs. Vera Hartwell's Queen Anne house overlooking the Cathedral Close, the morning sunlight slanted across the polished walnut floorboards of the drawing-room, illuminating the Chippendale bookcases, the blue and white Kangxi porcelain vases upon the mantelpiece, and the fragrant fire of cedar logs crackling in the hearth. Outside in the close, jackdaws were wheeling in noisy circles around the stone belfry, and an elderly canon was walking slowly toward the cloister with a leather-bound folio tucked beneath his arm. Mrs. Hartwell, dressed in her morning silks, handed a cup of hot China tea to Miss Hartley, who sat in the sunny bay window with her traveling cloak folded beside her chair. "The chief constable telephoned from Reading an hour ago, Judith," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Through the immediate cooperation of the Swiss Federal Police and the authorities in Amsterdam, 12 of the stolen antiquities have already been seized in the vaults of the Union Bank in Zurich. The remaining 9 pieces have been traced to private collections in America, where legal proceedings for their return have been initiated under the Hague Convention. The Calloway collection will be restored in its entirety." "That is a great comfort, Vera dear," Miss Hartley said with a gentle, modest smile. "Though it cannot restore, poor Sidney Orff to his family. No, Mrs. Hartwell sighed, wiping a tear from her eye. Poor, faithful Sidney. The trustees have voted unanimously to erect a bronze memorial plaque to his memory in the Egyptian wing, and to settle a generous annuity upon his widow and grandchildren. He was the true guardian of the museum. When I look back upon these past 3 days, Judith, what terrifies me most is not the wickedness of the crime, but the terrible ease with which a distinguished, educated gentleman was able to deceive an entire community for 3 years. We trusted him because he was an Oxford scholar. We trusted him because he wrote brilliant articles for the archaeological journals. We trusted him because his manners were impeccable, and his suits were well tailored. We never thought to ask whether the stone in the cases was real, because we assumed that a man of his standing was incapable of common theft. Miss Hartley smiled, her needles clicking with gentle, soothing precision. "My dear Vera," Miss Hartley remarked, "in St. Mary Mead our dear old vicar often says that education and culture are like the silver plating on an electroplated teapot. They give a very beautiful shine to the surface, but they do not change the quality of the base metal underneath. A gentleman of learning who allows his vanity to rule his conscience is far more dangerous than an ignorant poacher in the woods, because he possesses the intellect to construct an empire of lies, and the arrogance to believe that he will never be called to account." Miss Hartley looked out through the tall sash windows toward the ancient cathedral spire that rose into the clear blue Berkshire sky. "It is a strange reflection, Vera," Miss Hartley remarked softly, her knitting needles moving with gentle rhythm. "How very often the cleverest, most sophisticated deceptions are brought to ruin not by great detectives or brilliant scientists, but by the simple, patient honesty of ordinary people who do their duty without thought of reward. Dr. Croft spent 3 years writing beautiful catalogues, creating exquisite plaster replicas, and manipulating chemical formulas, but he was undone in an hour by an old man who simply knew what things ought to weigh. When I return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow, Miss Hartley said, resting her teacup upon the silver tray, I shall think so often of Sidney Orff. In our village churchyard there is a headstone to an old shepherd who tended his flock on the downs for 60 years, through gales and snowdrifts, without ever losing a single lamb. The world builds grand monuments to conquerors and prime ministers, but it is the faithful shepherds and the honest watchmen who keep the fabric of human society from falling into chaos. Mrs. Hartwell took Miss Hartley's hands in hers, pressing them with deep, tearful affection. You have brought peace to this house and justice to our town, Judith, Mrs. Hartwell said. We are grateful beyond words. Truth is always its own reward, Vera dear, Miss Hartley replied with her modest, serene smile, and a very great comfort to an old woman's heart. Mrs. Hartwell smiled, placing her hand affectionately upon Miss Hartley's arm. Calloway will never forget your wisdom, Judith. I did nothing, Vera, Miss Hartley said with quiet humility. I merely listened to the stones. And so the galleries of the Calloway Museum were cleared of their hollow replicas, the false numbers struck from the catalogue, and the truth restored to the quiet halls where history sleeps. It is a story that reminds us of the profound danger of intellectual vanity, and the enduring power of those small, overlooked truths that refuse to stay buried in the dark. I want to return to the question I asked you at the beginning of tonight's journey. Have you ever encountered a deception so beautifully constructed and maintained with such confidence that people preferred the comfort of the lie to the disruption of the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and the wisdom and reflections you bring to our little community are always the most rewarding part of these quiet hours. If Midnight Pages has become a peaceful refuge for you, a place where you can step away from the noise of the modern world, pull up a chair by the hearth, and lose yourself in a classic unhurried mystery. I would be truly honored if you would subscribe to the channel and share this evening's story with a friend who appreciates a good mystery well told. There are many more forgotten archives waiting for us, and more quiet hours to share together. This is David, bidding you a very good night from Ohio. Whatever ancient burdens or heavy secrets you may be carrying this evening, may they be weighed with mercy, and may the truth bring you peace.